Ukraine is more or less set to get F-16s, which will replace and augment their Soviet-era planes. Those will likely come online at the end of this year. But those will still make only a small difference. They are still fairly old models and they don't offer a crucial technological advantage over Russian planes. So this video tries to answer a hypothetical question. What if, instead of F-16s, NATO countries decided to send F-35s to Ukraine, train Ukrainian pilots, provide all the latest weaponry and simply make the maximum effort possible? How would those F-35s change the air war over Ukraine? The F-35 may help reshape the skies over Ukraine, but 100 years ago fighter planes helped shape the skies over World War I Europe. Coincidentally, this video is sponsored by Supremacy 1914. It's a grand strategy game where I just started playing as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At the start of the game, you pick countries to lead and then duke it out against real players. It's a PvP game and the goal is to take over Europe or even the whole world in some modes and win World War I. It's a real-time strategy, but know that matches take a while, up to a few weeks. That's why I like it. I do my work on the channel and check out how my orders are being executed several times a day. It's good that you can play with the same account on PC and mobile. And if you click on the link in the description below, you'll get 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Wanna win World War I? Give it a try. One thing Ukraine has going for it is the fact Russia is unable to find its Air Force units and neutralize them on the ground. We talked about that in several videos, but our recent video on expected F-16 combat performance in Ukraine explains it best, so we won't repeat ourselves here. The bottom line is that Ukraine is able to operate small groups of fighter jets and relocate them around the country when needed, not losing many planes. Most planes Ukraine seems to be losing are over the front lines, as they try to engage in air-to-ground operations or intercept Russian-owned air-to-ground ops. So it's also not likely Ukraine would be losing any more F-35s to Russian ground strikes if Ukraine had them. But F-35s may be easier to maintain on the flight line. Ideally, F-16s can make do with just 16 man-hours of maintenance for 1 hour of flight time. But in real-world conditions, there are examples of actual US F-16 units where 33 man-hours were needed per flight hour, which included preventative inspections. F-35A maintenance in the US Air Force units is down to just 5 to 9 man-hours per flight hour. Of course, maintenance itself is much more expensive for the F-35, as replacement parts are much more expensive, and as there is sometimes a scarcity of certain parts, it can happen that certain planes simply wait for parts and are not ready, sometimes leading to a fleet-wide issues with readiness rates. But all planes can have similar issues. The US Congressional Budget Office recently did a study on availability rates and came up with this. US F-16s had an availability rate of just 55% in 2020. That same year saw 63% availability rate for F-35A and 61% rate for F-35B. Mind you, availability rate is when the plane can execute at least one of its missions. Where the F-35s do have greater issue is full availability, where the plane is expected to execute all possible missions. Rates for those are visibly lower. So much so that the F-35B may not be ideal for Ukraine, even though it was in part made for that very kind of fighting. Besides operating from ships, the F-35B, which can land vertically, is also envisioned to be operated by US Marines from hastily prepared sites, very similarly to how Ukraine is using their current Air Force jets. Given that the F-35B with realistic combat and fuel load needs just 600 feet of runway for takeoff and requires almost no runway to land, it could come in very handy to Ukraine in its current operations. But while that might lower F-35B's dependence on infrastructure, it might all not be enough if actual time between missions due to maintenance suffers. F-35A, which does not land vertically, can do 2 missions per day of deployment, while F-35B does 1, it may be more logical to go with the A variant. As Russia is struggling to find even Ukrainian MiGs and Sukhois operating today, dispersed over western Ukraine. Also, for maximum effort and least maintenance woes, NATO would likely rotate airframes in and out of Ukraine. Whenever a plane needs more than just basic flight line maintenance, they would haul it out of Ukraine. For that, the A model may be better, as there are many more of those available. Once they are in the air, the A and B variants don't differ that much. They share the same sensors, their flight characteristics are similar, though the B variant has less fuel and has a somewhat shorter range. Their levels of stealth are also quite comparable. The B model lacks an internally placed gun, which isn't really an issue in today's combat. What could be an issue is B's smaller weapon base, so the B model would not be able to carry as heavy bombs, nor glide bombs such as JSOF if it wanted to remain stealthy. But it could still carry 4 AMRAAMs internally, as well as 500-pound laser bombs, 1,000-pound satellite-guided bombs, and small-form standoff guided bombs such as the SDB and Stormbreaker, which could be particularly effective for attacking time-critical tactical targets on the front line. But by far the most important assets F-35s would bring to the fight in Ukraine would be its stealth, its sensors, and its sensor fusion. When it comes to air-to-air battles, F-35 stealth would be pretty well set, used over the user's own territory, exclusively defensively, trying to deal with enemy planes flying over the front line. Expected air-to-air missions for those Ukrainian F-35s could be quick reaction interception from bases. Those might not be done as often, simply because trying to react to Russian planes flying low, below most radars, would not yield enough time for a F-35 to take off from western Ukraine and cross a few hundred miles to the engagement area. Another mission type might be combat air patrol, where the F-35s would already be in air, somewhat close to the front line, but still far enough not to show up on enemy radars. Though that too might be hard at all times, as turning the sides and the rear towards the enemy as the plane patrols in circles might very well show up on Russian radars. That could be partially mitigated by having the F-35 circle at low altitudes, but that would halve their mission endurance times, and it would make their radars more or less useless from said point. Also, keeping a constant air patrol uses a lot of planes. Basically, only a third of planes used up for such patrol could be actually on rotation in the air. Third mission type would be fighter escort for ground strike planes. Though the F-35 is good enough at multi-role capabilities that a 4-plane combat package could realistically often do without a dedicated fighter escort. Still, a plane or two hanging higher up, having a better view and more potential energy to react, sporting 4 AMRAAMs instead of 2 that the ground strike configured F-35s would have, would still be beneficial. What radar threats would those F-35s face? Russian ground-based radars. If operating in huge wavelengths like meter or near meter wavelengths, frontal RCS of the F-35 would spike up considerably, but still remain under the value of 1 meter squared, which is still enough that from a few hundred miles away the F-35 should remain hidden. Such radars are huge and not really shoot and scoot. It's not likely Russia would risk placing them very close to the front line, which would provide extra safety distance for the F-35s. Most plentiful early warning ground radars would be decimeter bandwidth ones, but against those, the F-35's radar cross-section can do fairly well, giving away a value less than 0.4 meters squared. As one approaches even shorter wavelengths, public source simulations done on possibly imprecise 3D models tend to lose their usefulness, as radar-absorbing materials start overtaking the shaping in their usefulness. What is known, however, is that the US Air Force, way back in 2005, estimated the F-35 would have a frontal radar cross-section of a metal golf-sized ball. But since then, US officials have stated great advances in materials have been made and have even said F-35's actual stealth is in some instances better than that of F-22. So it's not implausible that actual values for the F-35 against radars on Russian AWACS and Russian fighter jets are even better, possibly by an order of magnitude, equaling the marble-sized ball RCS which was claimed by the Air Force for the F-22. That would lead to practical radar detection ranges against the F-35 which are likely in the sub-30-mile range, as long as the F-35 keeps its frontal section turned towards the enemy. Russian maker of the Irbis radar found on the Su-35, which would be the most potent common opponent the F-35 might face, touted 90 km reach against a 0.01 meter square target. At 0.001 that drops to nearly 50 km or 30 miles. At 0.0001 that would drop further to just 20 or so miles. Furthermore, that measurement is done in the specific mode where the radar knows where to look. In actuality, a fighter radar would scan a large portion of the sky using less power and would not achieve such ideal range. Rather, a halved range would be more realistic. That being said, a Russian Su-35 could sometimes be cued by third-party radars and told, so to speak, where to look. Still, that could not be done perfectly, so maximum ranges stated by the manufacturer would still likely somewhat suffer. Another big threat would be the MiG-31M and its radar. While the radar itself is of older vintage, it has a huge array and has been modernized. Still, if Jane's as a source is to be believed, its performance is still somewhat behind the Irbis radar on the Su-35. The remaining fighter jets that Russia has with even remotely capable radar is the Su-30SM, but its ranges should be somewhat worse than those of the MiG-31's radar. So Russia might have little over 330 fairly potent fighters currently left, with none really being able to track the F-35 on their own from over 30 miles and possibly even less. The remaining Russian radar platforms that might be of some threat are the Su-57, Russia's first 5th generation fighter, and their AWACS. Russia has 10 Su-57 in active service and is not likely to risk them deep inside Ukraine. While Russia has some 20 or so AWACS, most are of Soviet vintage really, and would not be very useful due to obsolete electronics. 6 or 7 are the A-50U variant, which are modernized models with new radars. That's enough for 2 being on station nearly all the time. One over Belarus, for example, another just over the Sea of Azov. Their decimator wavelength radars might work a bit better against F-35, but still, given how frequencies scale up against stealth targets, ranges of 60 or so might be likely, not more, as long as the F-35 gets to show their best side to them. Much more problematic than the type of radar might be the location of radar, because the Ukrainian F-35s would not be observed by just one radar from one direction. If that were the case, F-35s could perhaps orient itself somewhat towards it and thus minimize its radar return. But in reality, when one looks at the map of Ukraine and the distances involved, there might be 2 or so AWACS searching from opposite directions, coupled with several meter wavelength radars all around Ukraine, coupled with whatever fighters' radars Russia might have up, which might be several around Ukraine if Russia is on the defensive, or a few dozen if Russia is doing an attack run. This depiction shows plausible rough locations and density of Russian radars in possible high-threat occasions. Each circle represents some 60 miles away from the Ukrainian F-35. So while the F-35 can move a lot inside Ukraine and remain undetected, that applies only to its frontal sector. When it comes to side views, things become much more risky for the F-35. Already at 35 or so degrees off nose, viewed in the horizontal plane, RCS against meter wave radar skyrockets to well over 1 meter squared, even approaching 10 meter values. At such values, meter wavelength radars may detect it even at 240 miles away. Going down to other less potent ground-based radars, those are likely to lose track of the F-35s even at 60 miles away, except for several short moments during a turn. F-35's wing leading surfaces, when perpendicular to the radar during a turn, will skyrocket in their signature. Similar issue will repeat when wingtips are perpendicular to radars. Basically, every such radar might see a turning F-35 flash a few times during that turn. Given their more numerous locations, when all those radars' data are accumulated, it's likely Russia would have sporadic updates of F-35's location as the F-35 moves through Ukrainian airspace. That might be enough to send some fighters its way, or it might be enough to try to lob some S-400 missiles its way, hoping that one of them would eventually come close enough so its own radar could lock onto the F-35. Those are all unsure deals, but sooner or later Russians would likely locate some F-35s in the air. And if it happens that a pair or two pairs of F-35s are threatened from a close distance by 3 or more times Russian planes, likelihood is that some F-35s will get hurt. Each F-35 carries 4 AMRAAMs in its stealthy state, and with missiles in general not having that great history of hits, it may find itself in a not so enviable position. Either it engages the enemy and risks running out of missiles, or it turns around to run away, but in doing that exposes its less stealthy rear to the enemy. All the while it is slower by Mach 0.2 or Mach 0.4 compared to the enemy. Depending on air-to-air loadout, a Su-35 might realistically pursue a target at Mach 1.8 to Mach 2.0. MiG-31s might be even faster. Ukrainian air defenses could very well help there, but those are too much of a question mark right now. Also, its stocks are likely getting close to running out of missiles. All the Western systems like Patriot have not arrived in high enough numbers to cover a significant part of Ukraine. Thus, Ukraine might be limited to doing interception with F-35s over a smaller area, one where they are sure they can run back under the SAM defense umbrella if Russia is determined to pursue them. But the real question would be how much damage could a fleet of F-35s do in the meantime to Russia? Even if participating in such unfavorable interceptions where Russians outnumber the F-35s, the Lightnings would plausibly manage to shoot down a few enemy fighters for each one of theirs, not counting the Ukrainian air defense skills. In the air, the F-35 still has many advantages over the Russian planes. Russian radar emission detection sensors are roughly 2 decades behind US ones. It's plausible Russians would have issues even tracking the F-35's radar, and the Lightnings could often work without their radars turned on. Flying over Ukraine, they would have plenty of third-party ground-based radars feeding them data. And even NATO's AWACS planes flying around Ukraine could see deep enough into Ukraine to feed the Lightning's data. A 2-ship Lightning formation could then approach a target completely silently, fire off their missiles silently, and the missiles would get mid-course updates from a second pair of Lightnings that are farther behind, from a safe distance. And even those would need to have their radars turned on fairly shortly, just for final target confirmation and sporadic missile course corrections. Lightnings have forward-looking optical infrared sensors just like Russian planes, but they also have distributed wide-area staring infrared sensors to cover all approaches to the plane. While Russian planes like Su-35 have missile approach warning sensors, those can't monitor the skies for enemy planes from medium distances, the way F-35's sensors can. So the F-35 can then, if it finds a potential threat, turn towards the contact and use its main infrared sensor, trying to identify the target silently without using its radar. When it comes to jamming radars and missiles in self-defense, Russian planes can on average rely on relatively old jammers. Their first digital radio frequency memory jammers were spotted in active service in 2015, and it's not likely many have been procured since then. Even those may be lacking when fighting modern radars, which can modify their pulses so those don't use repetitive patterns. And the majority of jammers available to Russian fighter jets are now nearly obsolete, like the Soviet-era Surbetsya. F-35s, on the other hand, can rely on 2 advanced jammers. One is the radar of the F-35 itself, which can work in jamming mode. Modern AESA radars have such a capability. The other is a towed decoy, called AL-70, which can either pose as an amplified radar return signal producer, drawing attention to itself rather than onto the F-35, or it can actively jam enemy radar itself. Coupled with the very small radar signature of the Lightning, it's plausible quite a few Russian missiles would have to be expended per F-35 in order to actually achieve a hit. There's also the situational awareness edge. Russian planes on the average have one sensor feed the pilot with one set of data, another sensor is feeding them with another set of data. Third-party radars would feed them yet another set of data via data links. Everything on the number and location of contacts, their heading, and so on, with the pilot's task being to mesh all those in one coherent interpretation of the tactical situation in their head. The F-35 pilot has all the data from all the sensors and third-party data links already processed and presented to him in a map of contacts and threats. Such sensor and data fusion is something that Russian manufacturers have touted only with their Su-57 fighters, which aren't numerous enough to be much of a factor. At best, some partial sensor fusion was at times mentioned for the Su-35s, which represent a third of the overall Russian advanced fighters and 1/6 of the overall Russian fighter-capable jets, as a lot of Russian fighters are still Soviet-era jets in essence. Finally, there's the AMRAAM missile. If Ukraine would get F-35s, it would also get the latest AMRAAM model, which is roughly a decade more advanced than the latest Russian variant of their R-77 missile. Besides the plausible electronics advantage, the range on the AMRAAM is considerable, though that applies to slow and non-alerted targets. If Russian planes would know they're being targeted, they would change course and AMRAAM's range would then be more comparable to the Russian missile's range. Russian R-37M missile might fare better, as it has a larger and more sensitive seeker. Its ample range, however, would be mostly useless against an F-35. Of course, ideally, Ukraine would not even send its F-35s to any unfavorable battle situations. Those would happen only if Russians managed to ambush the Ukrainian planes doing an ambush of their own. What Ukraine would do with its Lightnings is similar to what it would do with its F-16s when it gets them. It would attack the ground targets near the front line. Lobbing long-range missiles like the Storm Shadow, well, that can be done by old Su-24s if needed. But unlike the Ukrainian Su-25s and Su-24s that have been lost in fairly high numbers during their run over the front lines, the F-35s would be downed in much smaller numbers. Their stealth would enable them to fly high up and survive. Thus, they would be able to use the winged air-to-ground missiles more effectively, to the max of their range. And due to F-35's much more advanced radar and infrared sensor, the Lightning could search for targets on its own more easily than even the F-16, let alone the current Ukrainian Su-25s, which have to really put themselves in harm's way to search for targets on their own, lacking proper sensors. So F-35s might cause a much bigger headache to the frontline Russian vehicles and facilities, limited only by the fairly small number of F-35s operational at one time, which would be limited by the same factor limiting the real-world F-16 numbers, available Ukrainian pilots. It's simply not realistic that Ukraine could operate more than 2 or 3 dozen Western source planes in the next year or so. Of course, as we said in the beginning, none of this will happen. F-35s will not be sent to Ukraine, F-16s will. The reasons for that should be pretty self-explanatory. Yes, Lightnings are very expensive, but that's not an issue. The US can afford to pay for almost anything. It just recently approved making 5 more Patriot batteries for Ukraine. Each of those costs several times more than an F-35 jet. NATO countries themselves still don't have enough Lightnings. That's a bigger issue, as the US military would rather not be in a situation where it's lacking several dozen jets, if it ever fights China, for example. But the biggest reason is that NATO does not want the F-35 and newest systems like AMRAAM-D to be compromised. And any usage in war already compromises new weapons and systems. It's not even so much about F-35s being shot down. They would get shot down over Ukrainian-held territory, so it's unlikely Russia would get hands on the wreckage. It's even not so much about possible Russian spies in Ukrainian ranks getting glimpses of data on the planes, their sensors and missiles. But for the most part, it's about denying Russia the ability to observe the F-35 and its systems, missiles and so on in actual real-life war conditions. Because the more those are used against Russia, the more Russia would learn about them, about their limitations and potential areas to exploit. When F-35s fly in peacetime, they carry special radar reflector add-ons, which mask their true radar returns. In war, Russia would get to observe their Lightnings use their true maximum level of stealth, from many directions, in many instances, over and over, against many different Russian radars. Such datasets would offer a trove of data to Russia. And same could be applied to F-35's radar, its jamming system, its missiles, and so on. By spending its ace card on Ukraine, its highest tech card, the US would compromise its position in any possible future conflict. Because within a few years, Possibly faster than the US could adapt, Russia could devise ways to fight the F-35s more effectively, or sell all that data to China, teaching them how to fight F-35s more effectively. So F-35s being used by Ukraine is a nice thought exercise, which shows how much more potent they might be for Ukraine. But in the end, they would not be a silver bullet either, and might even end up costing the US even more in the long run. Hence, logically, they will likely remain just a thought exercise. Before we go, a few more details on Supremacy 1914, a free online PvP strategy game where you fight against hundreds of other players. You develop your provinces, research your weapons including better tanks, planes, cavalry, artillery, dreadnoughts. There are over 120 different units available. World War I was famous for its alliances, shaping the whole conflict. In Supremacy 1914 you can enter a pact with other players for world domination. Knowing who to ally with and when, who to trade with is a big part of the game. Click my link below the video to get a special bonus, exclusive to Binka viewers. You'll get 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. I usually do get myself the premium as it costs just a few bucks per month. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.